In the next two lectures, we're going to be talking about one of the most famous poets and also prose writers of the 20th century, Boris Pasternak, who was born into the intellectual circles in Russia that were probably at their height just about the time that he was growing up. In the 2 decades or the decade and a half before World War I, his family was intimately involved with some of the highest parts of Russian culture at that time. His mother, Rosa Kaufmann, was a well-known concert pianist. And of course, this was a time when music in Russia was developing in a very powerful way. The composers were getting their education, the same composers who would be probably the best composers of the 20th century. Pasternak, through his mother and through the people whom she knew, had a very close access to some of the highest musical creativity of the early part of the century. Pasternak's father, who had originally been born Jewish but was then converted to Christianity so he could take a full part in Russian cultural life, was an illustrator for Tolstoy, a very famous illustrator for some of Tolstoy's novels, so that as a very young man, Pasternak even saw Tolstoy and was very much involved in the people who revolved around Tolstoy, who were very much interested in Tolstoy's ideas, the so-called Tolstoyans, whom later on, by the way, in his novel, he rather lampooned and satirized. Clearly, he was a young man who was involved with Russian culture, as I said before, at the very, very highest level. As a university student, he went to Germany, as many young Russian people did at that time, where he studied at Göttingen and Heidelberg. Being in Germany, he found himself not only attracted to music, but also to philosophy, and did a great deal of work in philosophy. When he came back, he got involved in the poetic circles that were very powerful in Russia at that time, and rather soon got a reputation as part of a new generation of Russian poets who were exploring new forms of poetry, in many ways akin to that of futurists. Remember, we talked about the futurists in the case of Mayakovsky. Although Pasternak's art was considerably distant from Mayakovsky, he had sympathy for him as he did for many of the other poets who were doing entirely new things with poetry at that time, because it was a part of the spirit of the age. What he saw was new things sweeping through Russia, enormous changes taking place, and in those changes he saw tremendous possibilities for the development and the construction of the human spirit. When the revolution came, Pasternak had some sympathy for it. He thought that, well, here was a chance to break the old molds. Here was a chance to do entirely new things in Russian culture. Here was a chance for another class to come to power in Russia. In many, many different ways, he expressed considerable sympathy with the goals of the revolutionaries. Of course, he was probably much more in tune with those who were involved in the February-March Revolution, who wanted to see a democratic government. But even when the Bolsheviks came in, he was rather inclined to give them the benefit of the doubt, that somehow, with all of these changes, with the forcing of the intelligentsia to push itself into different molds, something creative, something better would come out of it. Of course, as time went on, when it came into the 1930s, he was involved in a very different reality. He began to realize, as of course virtually all of the Russian intellectuals did at that time, what Stalin's power meant to the world, that you either did it Stalin's way or you did it no way. That the government was getting ready to crack down on all of these tremendously creative things which had happened. In the 1920s, of course, there was a tremendous amount of new kind of architecture, a new kind of art, a new kind of music, a new kind of dance. There were all kinds of innovations in almost every area of the arts, almost every area of spiritual life. By the time of the 1930s, it became increasingly clear that the Soviet government was not going to go in that direction. The Soviet government was not going to have sympathy with these people who wanted new things in poetry. And of course, most especially after the doctrine of socialist realism, it became clear that a very, very different reality was in store. Now, Pasternak turned out to be very sensitive to the changes in the political climate and very adept at surviving in a time when many cultural figures became victims of Stalinist arrests and even executions. As we all know, by this time, Stalin's regime was guilty of the murder and of the annihilation of millions of people, even at that time, as well as later. This ugly part of the Stalinist regime is well known and, of course, can't be ignored. And yet, it's interesting that there were also other aspects of Stalin which Pasternak knew very well how to play on. There was a very powerful poet who wrote in those years, was contemporary with Pasternak. His name was Osip Mandelstam. Both he and Pasternak had the capacity of using these sonorities and the rhythms of the Russian language in a most extraordinary way. Mandelstam had had the courage at one time to snatch a list of people who were scheduled for execution out of the hands of the head of the secret police, tearing it up and running down the street, and he survived. It showed that he had a considerable amount of courage. Much, much later, Mandelstam eventually was arrested by Stalin's regime and perished in one of the forced labor camps in a rather terrible way. The story is told that one time when Pasternak was home, the telephone rang. When he picked it up, it turned out there was Stalin on the other end of the line. And Stalin said to him, "Tell me, what's your opinion of the poetry of Mandelstam?" Pasternak answered, "Well, you know, Yosef Vissarionovich," that's the way they called Stalin in those days, "Yosef Vissarionovich, asking one poet about another is a little bit like asking one beautiful woman about whether or not another woman is beautiful." Stalin is supposed to have replied, "Well, I suppose that means you don't think much of his poetry," and hung up. Later on, Stalin is supposed to have said, "Well, if it had been my friend, I could have defended him better than you did." To give you some idea of the power of Mandelstam's poetry, let me simply tell you something out of my own experience, that after the death of President Kennedy, the assassination of President Kennedy, within 12 days, that is the time it took letters to get from the Soviet Union to the United States, I got a letter from one of my friends at Moscow University that quoted a line from Mandelstam that had never been published in the time that this young man was alive. That line went something like this: "Человек умирает, a man dies. Песок устывает согретый, and the heated up sand cools down. И вчерашнее солнце на черных носилках несут, and yesterday's sun is carried out on a black stretcher." Listen to the weight and the sonority of those lines. Человек умирает, песок устывает согретый, и вчерашнее солнце на черных носилках несут. This was a poet who died in the forced labor camp. By that time he had gone out of his mind, and he thought they were trying to poison him, so he tried to steal the rations of his fellow prisoners, who were common criminals, who beat him mercilessly. And you get some idea of the fate of the intellectuals, the fate of poets, the fate of Russian culture in the regime of Stalin. And yet, this very same Stalin was capable of something else. One time in Moscow, in the evening, a woman who was known to be very, very religious and a very, very fine interpreter of Mozart, a pianist, played Mozart, and it was broadcast over Soviet radio. Stalin evidently heard it, liked it, and called the station and said he would like a copy of the recording. Well, as a matter of fact, there was no recording. They hadn't bothered to record it, so somewhere toward midnight, they got her out of bed, they got her back in the studio, and made a recording, which they sent to Stalin. Stalin listened to it and sent her a letter thanking her for the recording, and including some money, saying this is for your time and your labor, thanking her very much. She sent a letter back to Stalin saying, "Dear Comrade Stalin, thank you very much for your kind words. Thank you very much for the money. I've donated the money to the church to be used for assuaging the grief that you have caused, that your government's policy has caused many victims." When people heard that she had sent this letter, they said, "For goodness sake, woman, you've committed suicide. Don't you realize what you've done?" And as a matter of fact, absolutely nothing happened. There was simply no reaction to that letter. And quite a few years later, when Stalin died, he suffered an aneurysm and was lying on the floor for many hours in agony because people were afraid to come in to him. When they finally came in, they found that particular record on his phonograph. He was a complicated man. And there were aspects of Stalin that had much to do with culture, and had even some understanding of culture, and Pasternak obviously knew how to play on that, although one mustn't forget the other side of Stalin, the murderous side, responsible for the deaths of millions and millions of people. This was the atmosphere in which Pasternak had to survive, and he turned out to be a true master of it. He turned out to be a man who knew how to play the various aspects of Soviet culture in the absolutely worst days of Stalinism and survive himself, although his poetry was still known as some of the best poetry of that particular generation. One of the things that Pasternak did that saved him, as it saved many other poets at that time, he turned a great deal of his energy toward artistic translation. And many of his poetic translations are true masterpieces of the art. One of the things that happened to Soviet literature at that time is that we got translation at a very, very high level. There are few eras of poetic translation that have produced such marvelous products as that of the Soviet Union in the 1930s and the 1940s and even into the 1950s. Partly, of course, because there was a wonderful school of translation which had already been established, and of course there were extraordinary talents being used in the field of translation. Pasternak, of course, is an outstanding case in point. But also because in so doing they could avoid the dangers of creative effort which might well get them into deep trouble, even mortal trouble, given the Soviet reality in which they lived. Pasternak translated 5 Shakespearean tragedies. And Shakespeare, of course, had been of enormous interest in Russia up to that time. As a matter of fact, I think I've already mentioned that there were 17 full translations of Hamlet in the 20th century alone. Imagine what it takes to translate a play like Hamlet, and among them, Pasternak's was one of the greatest. And of course, in the violence of Shakespeare, in the politics of Shakespeare, Pasternak found many indirect and even sometimes direct references to the violence that was taking place at his time. Shakespeare became a kind of a statement for him, not only about life in general, but also about the conditions under which he had to live. Tolstoy never liked Shakespeare. I've always thought it's a case of professional jealousy. Not many people would think of being jealous of Shakespeare, but Tolstoy was at a level where he would think this way. But Tolstoy used to say that at night he would lock his bookcases. In those days they had glass fronts of bookcases. He would lock his bookcases at night so the murderers of Shakespeare would not get him in his sleep. And of course, this violence of Shakespeare was something that was deeply felt all the way through Russian culture, but most especially at this time when there was so much violence in Soviet society. One of Pasternak's most beautiful renditions comes near the end of Othello, when the Moor is standing over his beautiful sleeping wife, Desdemona, and contemplating the lovely light he's about to extinguish. And of course, these are very famous words in English. It is the cause, my soul. Let me not name it to you, you chaste stars. Pasternak has «Таков мой долг, стыжусь назвать пред вами девственные звезды». That those chaste stars, девственные звезды, is marvelous in Russian. Othello then goes on, if I quench thee, thou flaming minister, I can again thy former light restore, should I repent me. But once put out thy light, thou cunningst pattern of excelling nature, I know not where is that Promethean heat that can thy light relume. And here Pasternak absolutely walks on water. Когда я погашу светильник, об этом пожалею, не горе, можно вновь его зажечь. Когда ж я угашу тебя, сияние живого чуда, редкость без цены. На свете не найдется Прометея, чтоб вновь тебя зажечь, как ты была. Even those who don't know Russian can appreciate the incredible rhythm of those Russian lines, how he's managed to get the force and the power of Shakespeare's lines in a language very, very far from English.